Buildings remember things people forget. Cathedrals remember in sound, in the exact pitch a pipe holds or fails to hold, high in a loft where almost nobody ever thinks to listen closely. Franklin Osei has spent 27 years learning to listen inside St. Aldric's Cathedral, a Gothic revival church completed in 1911. Its original pipe organ, nearly 4,000 pipes housed in a loft above a nave, still played for every service, restored and expanded twice over the decades, but built around its original 1911 wind chest and pipe casework. He was 60 now, organ technician and cathedral facilities keeper, responsible for tuning, maintaining, and preserving an instrument older than anyone currently attending the cathedral. He had learned to trust that listening from a man named Wallace Crenshaw, who had kept the organ for over 25 years before him, and who believed, without needing to argue the point, that a pipe organ was a building's own voice, and a pipe that couldn't hold its pitch was trying to say something about the loft it stood in. Franklin started at St. Aldric's at 33, hired as Crenshaw's assistant during a period when the cathedral's aging organ was still being debated as either a treasure worth preserving or a liability worth quietly retiring. Crenshaw was 62 then, patient and unhurried, a man who climbed the narrow loft stair every season with a tuning fork and a notebook the way other men kept a doctor's appointment. This organ has been singing in this loft since before anyone alive today was born, Crenshaw told him. During Franklin's first week, the two of them standing among the towering ranks of pipes, while afternoon light filtered through the clear-story windows far below. Every pipe up here has its own voice, its own way of holding a note. When a pipe won't hold its pitch the way its neighbors do, that's not the pipe being difficult. That's the loft telling you something, if you're patient enough to keep listening. Crenshaw kept a tuning log, precise pitch measurements for specific pipes taken at every seasonal tuning, a level of documentation the cathedral never specifically required him. He did it because he believed the pipe organ's voice was the truest measure of whether the loft around it was still exactly what it had been built to be. Franklin remembered the first seasonal tuning he shadowed, watching Crenshaw work methodically down a rank of pipes with his tuning fork, humming each note softly to himself before comparing it against the fork's pitch. He'd asked, honestly curious, why anyone needed to check pipes that had sounded fine at the last service. Crenshaw had finished tuning the pipe in front of him before answering, unhurried as always. Fine at a service and true to pitch aren't always the same thing, he'd said. A congregation singing along won't notice a pipe drifting a few cents flat. I will. And if I don't write it down, next season I won't remember whether it drifted a little or a lot, or whether it was worse than the season before. The ear forgets. The page doesn't. When Crenshaw retired, he left Franklin a log, along with a piece of advice Franklin had carried for 27 years since. Don't just retune a flat pipe and move on. Ask why it went flat faster than the others. The loft is telling you something with its silence just as much as with its sound. St. Aldric's had been built in the confident Gothic revival style of 1911, its nave rising in stone arches toward a vaulted ceiling. The organ loft perched above the entrance at the rear of the nave, housing the instruments nearly 4,000 pipes in ranks that climbed toward the loft's own timber-framed ceiling. The organ had been restored once in the 1950s and expanded again in the 1980s, each project adding new ranks and modernizing the console, but the original 1911 wind chest and pipe casework at the heart of the instrument had never been fully replaced. Franklin knew the loft the way he knew his own hands. He knew which floorboard near the console creaked in humid weather, and which section of timber framing groaned faintly under the organ's own weight during a full congregational hymn. He knew the particular hush of the loft between services, when the pipe stood silent and the whole space seemed to hold its breath. He knew the smell of old wood, tin, and dust that lived permanently among the ranks no matter how carefully the loft was cleaned. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that pipe 32 in the great diapason rank, a tall wooden pipe near the loft's north wall, had always gone flat faster than any comparable pipe after every tuning. It wasn't dramatic. Most congregants sitting in the nave below never noticed anything unusual about the organ's sound, since a single pipe drifting slightly flat within a rank of dozens rarely stood out to an untrained ear during a full hymn. One visiting choir director, years back, had once remarked to Franklin after a Sunday service that something in the great diapason had sounded a touch thin toward the end of the final hymn, unable to name anything more specific than that vague impression. Franklin had written a comment into the log that same afternoon, because it was the closest anyone outside the loft had ever come to noticing what he and Crenshaw had been tracking for decades. But Crenshaw had noticed it first, decades earlier, tuning fork in hand, walking the ranks during his seasonal visits, and finding Pipe 32 already drifting while its neighbors held true. Crenshaw's earliest entry about it, dated 1974, read, "Pipe 32 flat again, third time since Easter. Wind pressure checked, tuning slide sound, no leak detectable. Every other pipe in the rank holds true for months. This one never does. Something in that section of the loft won't leave it alone. Watching it." Franklin had read that entry during his first winter with the log, sitting in the small workshop tucked behind the loft's north wall, and had felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Crenshaw had noticed something real. Crenshaw had never solved it, and Crenshaw had kept tuning and recording anyway. Season after season, patient enough to preserve a pattern he never got to finish explaining. Franklin continued the seasonal tuning checks without ever being asked to. Every season, the same tuning fork against Pipe 32, the same premature drift, the same faithful neighbors holding their pitch for months, while Pipe 32 needed attention again within weeks. In his 12th year at the log, Franklin began recording something Crenshaw's earlier entries had never quite captured with enough precision: the exact rate at which Pipe 32 drifted flat after each tuning, measured in cents per week rather than simply noting how many times a season it needed retuning. It took him nearly a decade of those precise measurements to see what Crenshaw's simpler notes could only imply. The rate of drift wasn't holding steady. It was accelerating. The pipe going flat a little faster each year, slowly enough that any single season's readings looked unremarkable, unmistakable once laid out across 10 years of careful figures. Every other pipe in the great diapason rank continued holding its pitch normally for months at a stretch, exactly as they always had. Pipe 32 alone kept needing attention sooner and sooner. He sat with that realization one evening in the workshop. Crenshaw's oldest log opened beside his own decade of drift measurements. The cathedral quiet around him the hour after evening prayer had ended. 2 men, 1 pipe. Over 40 years of the same patient question. Neither of them ever quite ready to call it solved, and neither of them ever willing to stop tuning it either. He thought about every hymn the congregation had ever sung beneath that loft, never knowing that one small wooden pipe, high above their heads, had been quietly losing its pitch faster and faster for decades, its neighbors singing true the entire time. Decades of weddings, funerals, and ordinary Sunday mornings, all of them carried on a sound that had been quietly, patiently thinning at one single point the whole time, noticed by only a handful of trained ears, and fully understood by none of them. He wrote a new entry beneath Crenshaw's oldest one, in the same plain hand. 10 years of drift measurements confirm Pipe 32's flattening rate is not stable. It is accelerating, slowly, consistently. Every neighboring pipe in the rank holds normally, 'cause still unknown, continuing to measure. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Franklin had a theory in his 16th year that the cause might simply be an internal flaw in Pipe 32's own century-old wooden construction, a known characteristic of some antique organ pipes. Whether it would itself develop subtle warping or internal cracking over decades that could explain a persistent tuning instability, without requiring anything outside the pipe at all. He spent the better part of summer having Pipe 32 carefully removed, inspected by a specialist organ builder, and where possible reinforced internally, confident he had finally found something a skilled craftsman's hands could permanently correct. The pipe drifted flat again within weeks of being reinstalled, at almost exactly the accelerated rate his 10-year trend predicted. The internal reinforcement had made no measurable difference. Whatever was affecting Pipe 32's pitch stability wasn't happening inside the pipe's own wood. It was happening somewhere beneath it, in the loft floor the pipe's foot rested against. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the log, in the same unembellished style Crenshaw had taught him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Internal pipe wood theory, ruled out. Pipe rebuilt and reinforced. Drift returned on schedule at accelerated rate. The cause is not the pipe. It is beneath it, back to unexplained. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the pipe's own wood to be the answer, a craftsman's fix, a summer's careful labor, and a closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere inside the loft's original 1911 timber framing, in a section of the cathedral's oldest structure nobody had opened in decades. The preservation grant announcement arrived in its 21st year. St. Aldric secured funding to reinforce the organ loft's aging floor structure, installing new steel support brackets bolted directly into the loft's original 1911 timber framing at evenly spaced intervals across the entire loft floor. The project treated every section of the historic framing as structurally identical, exactly as the cathedral's surviving architectural drawings described it. Franklin read the project brief and felt an old unease sharpen. If something in the timber framing beneath Pipe 32 had been quietly changing for over 40 years, rigid new steel brackets bolted into that exact section, assuming uniform century-old timber throughout, were about to be anchored into the one part of the loft that had never actually behaved like the framing around it. He brought Crenshaw's log, along with his own decade of drift measurements, to the preservation engineer overseeing the reinforcement. The engineer, a capable and fair-minded woman named Odalise Ferran, inspected the timber framing near Pipe 32 and found it structurally sound, showing no visible sagging, splitting, or distress anywhere along its length. "This framing looks solid throughout," Ferran said, reviewing her inspection notes at a small table set up in the loft. "My honest read is that a pipe going flat faster than its neighbors is almost certainly an internal characteristic of that specific pipe, with movement, grain irregularities, something inherent to a century-old wooden pipe's own construction. It has no bearing on the framing reinforcement plan. The new brackets are designed to stabilize the floor structurally, regardless of what's happening acoustically inside any individual pipe." "I already had the pipe itself inspected and reinforced," Franklin said. "New internal work, done by a specialist. The drift came back within weeks at the same accelerating rate it's shown for decades. It isn't the pipe. Crenshaw wrote in 1974 that something in that section of the loft wouldn't leave the pipe alone. My own numbers say whatever that is has been getting worse every year since." Ferran considered that, and to her credit, didn't dismiss it outright. "I don't have another explanation for a trend like that, but a visual inspection showing sound, undistressed timber doesn't give me grounds to treat one section of framing differently in a uniform reinforcement plan. The grant scope is stabilizing the entire loft floor, not investigating one pipe's tuning history." It was a reasonable position, and Franklin didn't have a structural engineering credential to argue against it. What was over 40 years of a pattern that had outlasted a full pipe rebuild, and a growing conviction that timber-looking sound to the eye wasn't the same as timber that had never moved at all. Franklin didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. What if Ferran was right, and 40 years of careful tuning amounted to nothing more than an old pipe's inherent, harmless quirk, a pattern he and Crenshaw, between them, had slowly turned into a structural mystery through nothing but 2 careers of devoted, perhaps overly sentimental attention to a single voice among 4,000? He had wanted, for years, for the accelerating drift to mean something real. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He pulled Crenshaw's oldest log out one more evening and reread the 1974 entry under the workshop's single desk lamp. Something in that section of the loft won't leave it alone. Watching it, Crenshaw had never known the cause either. He had simply kept tuning, season after season, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Franklin had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether it could stand against a clean visual inspection and a reasonable engineer's project scope. He didn't have the cause confirmed. But not having it hadn't stopped Crenshaw from writing the first entry in 1974. It wasn't a reason for Franklin to stop pushing now. Not with rigid steel brackets about to be bolted into a section of framing his own decade of numbers, so it was still quietly moving. He requested, at his own initiative, a single day with a timber structure specialist before the bracket installation reached the north wall section. Not to delay the reinforcement. He made clear, only to understand what was actually happening inside that framing before new steel locked whatever it was doing into place for another generation. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed historic timber frame structures for hidden load path alterations. She reviewed whatever original 1911 drawings the cathedral still possessed alongside a set of 1938 renovation records she located in the diocese archive, cross-referencing them against Franklin's decade of drift data, and she spent a day examining the exposed framing near Pipe 32 with a moisture meter and a small borescope. Once a section of loft flooring was lifted during the reinforcement project's early phase. What she found explained over 40 years of a drift that nobody had ever been able to name. "There's a modification here that doesn't match your original drawings," Priya said, showing Franklin the borescope footage at a table set up near the loft console. "This looks like it was done in 1938. I found a brief mention in the diocese archive of an electric blower being installed for the organ's wind supply that year, replacing the original hand pump bellows. Whoever did that work cut through the section of timber framing to route a new duct, and rerouted the load path onto a different set of members than the original design intended. It was never formally filed as a structural change, just noted as an equipment upgrade." "And that's been moving," Franklin said, "very gradually settling under the added weight of the duct and blower assembly for over 80 years, Priya said. "Just enough to subtly flex the loft floor beneath Pipe 32, affecting the pipe's internal air column and pitch stability. As the timber settlement slowly compounds, that flex gets very slightly worse, which is exactly why the drift rate has been accelerating rather than staying constant. New rigid steel brackets bolted into the same section, unaware of the ongoing settlement, will be fighting an active structural movement indefinitely, right at one of the few points in the loft still quietly shifting beneath for 1,000 pipes." Priya's findings went to the Preservation Committee within the week. Odalise Farran reviewed the borescope footage and archive record personally and called Franklin afterward. "You were right to push for this," Farran said. "The timber looked sound because from the outside, I had no way to know an 87-year-old equipment upgrade had quietly rerouted its load path. If we'd bolted rigid brackets into that section as planned, we have fought an active settlement indefinitely and probably destabilized the one part of this loft already working against itself." The reinforcement plan was revised. The section of framing beneath Pipe 32 was properly restored to accommodate the 1938 load path alteration, stabilized against further settlement before any new steel brackets were installed nearby. The rest of the loft floor reinforcement proceeded afterward, anchored into timber that finally matched what the cathedral's own drawings had always assumed it would be. Street Aldric filed a formal note in its facilities archive, crediting both Wallace Crenshaw's original 1974 observation and Franklin's 27 years of continued measurement as the reason a hidden structural alteration had been found and properly addressed before rigid modern hardware locked 80 years of unexamined settlement into place for good. Franklin kept Crenshaw's log. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving the whole collection into the cathedral's permanent archive. Framing beneath Pipe 32 restored and stabilized this year. Load path alteration traced to an undocumented 1938 blower installation, documented informally through the pipe's tuning drift since 1974. First season on record with Pipe 32 holding its pitch as long as its neighbors. "Wallace, you were right. The loft was telling us something with that pipe silence. Neither of us knew what for a very long time." He climbed the loft stair on a quiet morning not long after, tuning fork in hand, and sounded Pipe 32 alongside its neighbors for the first time since the repair. All of them held true, together, in the same patient chord. He thought about Crenshaw, standing among these same ranks decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that a pipe organ was a building's own voice, and a pipe that couldn't hold its pitch was trying to say something about the loft it stood in. Franklin had carried that sentence through 27 years, through a ruled-out pipewood theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of careful listening had amounted to anything more than devotion to a single voice among thousands. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep listening, the way Crenshaw had taught him, until the law finally explained, to the one pipe patient enough to keep asking, exactly what had been quietly settling beneath it for over 80 years.